Every financial decision you make passes through a filter first. Before you evaluate the opportunity, before you run the numbers, before you decide whether something is possible or not. The filter runs. And that filter is the story you hold about who you are in relation to money. Not a conscious story, not one you sit down and recite to yourself. A background narrative, running quietly, shaping what you reach for and what you don't reach for, what you attempt and what you dismiss before attempting. Most people don't notice the filter because it doesn't feel like a filter. It feels like reality. When an opportunity appears and something inside you immediately says, "That's not for someone like me," that doesn't feel like a story running. It feels like an accurate read of the situation. When a salary negotiation comes up and you settle for less than you intended, it doesn't feel like the narrative won. It feels like you read the room correctly. You didn't want to push too hard. You were being realistic. You were protecting the relationship. The story doesn't announce itself. It justifies itself. And because it justifies itself, it's almost impossible to see from the inside. This is why two people can be in nearly identical financial situations and move in completely different directions. Same income, same starting point, same access to information. One builds, one doesn't. And the difference isn't discipline, it isn't intelligence, it isn't even work ethic. It's the story each person is running about what's available to them. One story says, "This is the kind of position I can build from." The other says, "This is the kind of position people like me stay in." Both stories feel like accurate assessments. Neither one is neutral. And only one of them is building anything. The narrative shapes behavior before behavior has a chance to shape outcomes. You don't attempt what the story has already ruled out. You don't hold a negotiation the story says you'll lose. You don't pursue a position the story says isn't meant for you. You don't start building when the story says you don't have enough to begin. And because you don't attempt, you don't get data. And without data, the story never gets challenged. It just keeps running, keeps filtering, keeps producing the same decisions, inside the same range, toward the same outcomes. This is not about confidence. This is not about self-belief in the motivational sense. This is about a background operating system that was installed before you had the awareness to examine what was being installed. It processes financial information through a set of assumptions about who you are and what that means for what you can build. And until those assumptions are surfaced, until the story becomes visible as a story rather than invisible as reality, it will keep doing exactly what it was built to do. Filter out the options that don't match the narrative, before you ever consciously decide whether to pursue them or not. That's not a mindset problem. That's a visibility problem. And visibility is where everything starts. The story doesn't just shape decisions, it sets a ceiling, an invisible upper limit on what you attempt, what you accept, and what you walk away from. And the ceiling isn't visible until you get close enough to hit it. Think about how this works in practice. Someone gets a raise, more than they expected, more than they felt comfortable asking for. And instead of holding that position, instead of letting it become the new normal, something shifts. They start spending differently, lifestyle expands, new commitments appear, the income gets absorbed. And within a year, the financial pressure feels roughly the same as it did before the raise. This isn't irresponsibility. This is the ceiling operating. The story has a set point, a level of financial reality that feels correct for someone like me. And when income rises above that set point, behavior unconsciously adjusts to bring things back into alignment with the story. The same mechanism works in reverse. Someone loses income, things get tight, and they grind back to where they were. Not because they're exceptional, because the set point pulls in both directions. Down when things rise above it, up when things fall below it. The ceiling functions like a thermostat, always returning to the temperature the story says is normal. And this is why income alone doesn't change financial position long term. If the story doesn't change, the ceiling doesn't change. And a higher income without a higher ceiling just produces a more expensive version of the same financial reality. The ceiling also operates in what you choose to pursue. Opportunities that exist above the set point don't feel like opportunities. They feel like risks, overreach, things that work for other people but probably not for you. So you don't pursue them. Not because you evaluated them carefully and decided they weren't right, because the story filtered them out before evaluation began. The ceiling determined the range before the analysis started, and you end up optimizing within a range that was never consciously chosen. This is one of the most costly and least visible financial dynamics most people experience. Because from the inside, it doesn't feel like a ceiling. It feels like being realistic. It feels like knowing your limits. It feels like not overextending. All of which sound like wisdom. But wisdom and a ceiling can produce identical behavior from very different places. One comes from honest evaluation. The other comes from a story that was never examined. And if the ceiling was never consciously set, it was built by something else. The environment you grew up in, the financial position of the people around you, the repeated experiences that told you what was and wasn't available to someone in your position. The ceiling was constructed from the outside, from experiences you didn't choose, from a financial environment you were born into, and it's been operating quietly on the inside ever since, setting the range, filtering the options, returning you to the set point every time you drift above it. Most content talks at you. This one sits with you. If that difference stood out, if this felt real instead of loud, like the video, subscribe. This channel is built for people who notice patterns. The story you hold about yourself and money didn't come from nowhere. It was built, layer by layer, over years, from inputs you didn't choose in an environment you didn't design. And understanding where it came from is the first step toward seeing it clearly enough to change it. The earliest layer is the household. Before you had any direct relationship with money, before you earned it, spent it, or managed it, you were watching how the people around you related to it. Whether money was discussed openly or avoided entirely, whether it was a source of tension or something handled with ease, whether there was always enough or whether not enough was the permanent background condition. You absorbed all of it, not as lessons, as atmosphere. And atmosphere shapes belief more deeply than instruction. Because instruction can be questioned. Atmosphere just becomes the way things are. The second layer is repetition. Certain experiences, certain financial realities, repeated often enough, stop feeling like circumstances and start feeling like identity. Growing up without consistent financial stability doesn't just affect the bank account. It builds a reference point, a baseline understanding of what normal looks like, what to expect, what kind of financial reality belongs to someone in your position. And that reference point, repeated across years of experience, becomes a self-concept. Not, I am currently in a difficult financial position, but this is the kind of financial position someone like me occupies. That shift from circumstance to identity is where the ceiling gets built. The third layer is the people closest to you, not just immediate family, but the broader environment of people whose financial reality formed the edges of what felt normal and possible. If everyone you knew closely worked hourly jobs, hourly work felt like what work is. If nobody in your direct environment owned anything that produced income, ownership felt like something that happened elsewhere, to other kinds of people, in other kinds of lives. You don't need anyone to tell you that something isn't available to you. You just need to never see it close enough to feel real. And most people's formative environments provided a narrow enough window that entire financial possibilities were effectively invisible. None of this is blame. The people who shaped your environment were operating from their own stories, built from their own environments, passed down through their own experiences. The story has a lineage, and understanding that lineage does two things. It removes the personal dimension from what is actually a structural inheritance, and it makes the story visible as a story rather than as an accurate description of what you are and what's available to you. Because the story was built from circumstances, not from facts, circumstances change, and a story built from circumstances that no longer exist doesn't have to keep running just because it was installed early. Seeing where it came from is how you start to see that it doesn't have to be where you stay. The story doesn't change because you decide to think differently. That's not how narrative works. You can tell yourself a new story 100 times, and the old one will still run underneath it, still filter, still set the ceiling, still return you to the set point. Because the old story wasn't built through thought. It was built through experience, through repetition, through years of evidence that accumulated into a felt sense of what's real and what's available. And the only thing that rewrites that is new evidence. Not affirmation, not visualization, not deciding to believe something different. Evidence. Actual experiences that don't fit the old narrative. Real outcomes that the old story said weren't available. Small proof points that the ceiling was a construction rather than a fact. This is why action matters more than belief change when it comes to rewriting the story. You don't update the narrative first and then act differently. You act differently, in small, deliberate ways, and the narrative updates in response to what those actions produce. What does that actually look like? It looks like attempting something the old story said wasn't for you, and finding out the outcome wasn't what the story predicted. It looks like negotiating when the story said you'd lose and getting more than you asked for. It looks like starting a position, however small, and watching it produce something independent of your presence. Each of those experiences is a data point, and data points accumulate the same way the original story accumulated. Through repetition, through evidence, through experiences that stack into a new felt sense of what's real. This is slow work. The original story was years in the making. It won't be replaced in a week or a month or through a single experience. But the direction matters more than the speed. Every action that produces an outcome the old story said wasn't possible is a crack in the ceiling. Not a demolition, a crack. And cracks compound the same way capital compounds. Slowly at first, then faster than expected. Then suddenly the ceiling that felt structural and permanent reveals itself as something built, and therefore, something that can be rebuilt. The financial decisions you make are downstream of the story you're running. The positions you pursue, the negotiations you hold, the options you see as available, the ones you dismiss before trying. All of it filtered through a narrative that was installed before you could examine it. Changing that narrative doesn't require a dramatic moment. It requires small actions taken consistently in directions the old story said weren't for you. Each one producing evidence. Each piece of evidence updating the story slightly. Each update expanding the ceiling by a fraction. Over time, the fraction becomes a floor instead of a ceiling, and what felt impossible from the old position starts to feel like the obvious next move from the new one. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.